All right, so it's just ticked over to midday. So we might just get a start as some of the other guys start coming through. So hi everyone, and welcome to Stock Up, a practical guide to biosecurity. So it's just ticked over to midday, so we'll get a start. So my name is Patrick McDonald, and I'm the project manager for StockSense. Today we are fortunate enough to have Emily Buddle and Sophie Hemley joining us from Animal Health Australia to talk through developing a biosecurity plan fit for your farm. Before I hand over to Emily and Sophie, I'll just give a brief overview of StockSense and run through some housekeeping. I will note that we are recording this webinar, so if for any reason you do need to leave the webinar early, there will be a recording available afterwards. So to begin with, I'll just give everyone a brief overview of StockSense. So StockSense is a producer-led extension program which aims to help producers adopt animal health and production practices that improve animal welfare and maintain Victoria's biosecurity status. StockSense is funded by the Cattle Compensation Fund and the Sheep and Goat Compensation Fund and is proudly delivered by the VFF Livestock Group. So what does StockSense have to offer you? So StockSense is open to all Victorian livestock owners and will give you access to face-to-face events across Victoria, webinars such as the one you're on today, social media channels including Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, as well as other resources like fact sheets and newsletter articles. On top of this, we are also a point of contact for all livestock producers if they have any questions regarding animal health, welfare, or biosecurity. So why have we chosen biosecurity for today's webinar? So basically, maintaining sound biosecurity practices works to keep stock free from diseases and pests that reduce productivity, affect animal welfare, close export markets, or reduce prices, and may be passed on to humans. I'll leave Emily and Sophie to cover on the rest of that, but just want to touch on the point that we're always on the lookout for any topics. So if there is a particular topic that you think might be of interest to Victorian producers, please feel free to reach out and let us know. Your feedback is very important to us, which leads on to my next point. Feedback from primary producers such as yourselves will help shape this project and ensure we are targeting what is most relevant to you. This will include some short surveys during and following our events. So just to begin with, I'll just get everyone to answer a few short questions for me. Apologies. Isabel, I might just get you to give me a hand getting the survey up. So we'll just get the poll to go live now. So you should just see a few questions pop up in front of you. So first one is just your main occupation, followed by what part of Victoria you're from, and finally, whether or not you have a biosecurity plan on your farm. So I'll just leave that open for a few questions, just while everybody fills that out. Perfect. So we've got some of those results coming through. So I'll just shut off that survey in 3, 2, 1, and the poll. Perfect. And I'll just share those results with you. So as you can see today, we've got majority cattle producers, which is not surprising. We've got a nice even spread across Victoria, and it's a split of about 50-50 of whether or not people have a biosecurity plan on their farm. So that's really good to see, and hopefully everybody will learn something new today. So I'll stop sharing that. And we'll also follow that up with a survey just at the end of the webinar, just to get any feedback from you all about what you've learned throughout the webinar. And finally, just a bit of housekeeping. So today you will be able to ask questions, and we really do encourage you to ask a lot of questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So Emily and Sophie will do their best to answer questions throughout the webinar. If time permits, at the end of the webinar, we will try and run through any outstanding questions. Now, I'll just hand over to Emily and Sophie in a second, but I just want to let everyone know that we are really eager to engage with producers as much as possible. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions or any ideas that you think StockSense might be able to help with. So the best point of contact for us is through email. So that's stocksense@vff.org.au. You can visit our webpage at vff.org.au/StockSense, or you can follow us on social media at VFF StockSense on Twitter and Instagram, or just StockSense on Facebook. So thank you for your time, everyone. Now what I'll do is I'll hand over to Sophie and Emily, and we can get stuck into today's webinar. Perfect, thank you.
Thanks, Patrick. I'll just head over to, once you stop sharing your screen, I'll be able to pop mine up.
Yeah.
So while we're just sorting that out, thanks again to StockSense for inviting Sophie and I here today to give this webinar. Sophie and I are both biosecurity extension managers with Animal Health Australia. Our primary role is actually to deliver against the National Sheep Industry Biosecurity Strategy, which is an initiative of sheep producers and wool producers and Animal Health Australia. And our role is basically just that, biosecurity extension in our respective jurisdictions. So I'm actually based in South Australia and Sophie's based in Western New South Wales, but we certainly engage and collaborate with the likes of VFF and StockSense to be able to contribute when we can and where we can. So just to start off with, I'll just give a brief overview of who Animal Health Australia is. So we are an independent national body who bring together government and industry to work across Australia to make sure that our biosecurity system is prepared and ready to respond for both emerging and existing threats, and to also maintain that strong market access for livestock producers. We have 33 member organisations, and those members include the likes of Cattle Council, sheep producers and wool producers, service providers including CSIRO and the Australian Veterinary Association, and then we also have associate members like Wildlife Health Australia. But we've also got both state and federal governments as our members. And so our ultimate goal is to really facilitate those partnerships between governments and industries for the funding of the animal health programs to make sure that we are maintaining biosecurity and that market access. So why is biosecurity important? At the end of the day, biosecurity is really about underpinning our productivity. So ensuring that our animals are healthy and we're maintaining that strong welfare aspect. It maintains our market access. So a lot of the time our international markets are wanting proof that we are free of disease and those sorts of things, and that we are managing disease spread across our country and within our industries. It also gives our consumers and our customers confidence in the product that we produce. So by being able to demonstrate that we have these diseases under control, or we're doing the best that we can to prevent diseases from coming in and spreading within the industries, we're able to provide that assurance that we are producing a quality product. Then, of course, it also protects our natural environment. So we've got diseases, pests, weeds, and those sorts of things that can certainly be catastrophic to the environment in which we work in. So just to touch briefly, when we talk about biosecurity, we're talking about the prevention of both endemic and emergency animal diseases. We often talk about endemic disease management as peacetime, or when we're talking about freedom from emergency diseases, we talk about peacetime. So endemic animal diseases are those that are already present and are maybe managed or maintained. Whereas on the flip side, our emergency animal diseases, or EADs, can have severe impacts on trade, production and the environment, and or human health. Most emergency animal diseases are exotic to Australia, so they aren't actually present within our borders at this point in time, but some are endemic and if uncontrolled can cause issues. So an example of that would be anthrax. So an endemic disease for a human context is influenza, or as we commonly know it or refer to it as the flu. And as we all know, an emergency disease for humans would be COVID-19. So we've obviously, during standard times, we manage the flu through vaccinations, cleanliness and those sorts of things. And when we do have a disease that we haven't necessarily seen before, we put extra protocols in place like border closures and all of the things that we've seen in the past 2 years with COVID-19. So to bring that into context for animals, for example, an endemic disease example would be benign foot rot, an endemic disease, and an emergency animal disease would be foot and mouth. So for an example, again, of an endemic disease, talking about virulent foot rot, it's estimated to cost the sheep meat and wool industries approximately 44 million per annum. And those losses come from loss of production and the cost of control and eradication. So we obviously have programs in place to be managing these, managing foot rot, particularly in certain states. And biosecurity is all about minimising the risk of that foot rot incursion and obviously reducing the losses that may be experienced through productivity and introducing those unnecessary costs associated with management and eradication if the producer decides to go down that path. And on the flip side, an emergency animal disease such as foot and mouth or FMD. So the cost of a single state outbreak. So if we only experience an outbreak in Victoria, for example, it's estimated to cost $100 million in control, and there's an estimated $5.9 billion in revenue losses. If there was an outbreak to occur in multiple states or multiple jurisdictions, so South Australia and Victoria, for example, or if we're trading into New South Wales, the estimated control costs almost quadruple to that 370 million. And then there's an estimated loss of 51.84 billion in revenue losses. And I guess we put these numbers up here to really emphasise the importance of biosecurity and ensuring that we are doing the best we can to prevent the incursion of these diseases into Australia, but also the spread. So biosecurity is really about working together collaboratively to make sure we're minimising the risk of disease, pest and weed incursion. So biosecurity is a shared responsibility at the end of the day. We have multiple stakeholders that have vested interest in the biosecurity and the disease-free status of Australia. So we've got the likes of federal government who are responsible for things like border control and import and export protocols. Then move down or move out to our state and territory governments. So each state and territory have their state-specific legislation and everyone has their different legislative requirements that fall under their specific acts. And so we all have uniqueness in that. We also have industry surveillance and assurance programs such as the TSE and the sheep map programs. And then we're moving down into what we're talking about today in terms of farming enterprises and those on-farm biosecurity plans. And I guess we all have our role to play within the structure of biosecurity. The on-farm biosecurity plans are really about the fact that producers or those that are on the ground with the animals or the livestock on a day-to-day basis are really going to be that first port of call when detecting diseases if and when they do come onto farm or into Australia. Often when I talk about biosecurity, I talk about the circle of influence or the circle of control. And this can be used in many different contexts, but realistically, there's 3 circles, and the outer circle is the circle of concern. So these are things that we don't or can't necessarily influence on the ground as livestock producers. So things like international trade, legislation, rules and regulations, commodity prices, an EAD, outbreak threat, imports and those sorts of things. We don't necessarily have any control over those, but they're certainly of concern when we're talking about biosecurity. When we move into the next circle, it's the circle of influence. So it's the stakeholders and the people that you interact with that, again, you don't necessarily have control over, but you may be able to influence and encourage them to do different things, particularly with regards to your farm biosecurity. So people like your clients and customers, any contractors that may come in to help with things like hay cutting or hoof trimming and those sorts of activities, your neighbours or even your livestock agents. So those people that you interact with on a daily basis through business and asking them to do things like if they're entering your property, making sure that they have clean boots or clean clothing as they enter production zones, or if you've got a contractor, for example, making sure that they've done the appropriate wash downs. They've washed down their plant and equipment before they enter your cropping paddock and those sorts of things. And the last circle is that circle of control. So the circle in the middle. And realistically, that is what you can control, which is your own on-farm biosecurity practices. So what your expectations are for people coming into your property, what you're doing within the limits of your boundary fences and your community to make sure that you're not spreading the weeds, pest and disease that, that we are focusing on with biosecurity. And biosecurity really is about risk management. So it's about managing the risk of pests, weeds, disease and contaminants from entering, establishing and spreading within the country, state, region or property. And as I alluded to before, it's a shared responsibility. So who has responsibility for the different areas and the different jurisdictions? When we're talking about on-farm biosecurity, it's obviously what you're doing to manage the risk of pests, disease, weeds and contaminants from entering your property and probably also your region. So what you're doing to make sure that you're not spreading it between properties like your neighbours or roadsides and all of those sorts of things. On-farm biosecurity is about doing that risk analysis and then what practical measures you are implementing on farm to minimise the risk. So keeping things in, keeping things out, minimising that impact and making sure something doesn't happen to you. So doing everything within your power to minimise that risk. So why have a biosecurity plan? It's the best defence a producer can have against livestock pests and diseases. And no, we're not talking about the piece of paper. That piece of paper that you've documented your biosecurity plan on is not going to be what protects you against those pests and diseases. What we're talking about is a plan to demonstrate what you're doing on your property to prevent. So it's implementing the practices outlined in that plan, which results in an immediate and ongoing and cumulative return. Reduces the risk of that pest and disease incursion on your property. And it also allows for quicker recovery and losses to be minimised if a disease event occurs. So, for example, Sophie has regularly reflected on her time working as a district vet in New South Wales, and what she really likes about having a biosecurity plan and all the documentation that sits behind that is when she does go to a property and needs to help with the disease investigation, the producer's got that paperwork that they can hand over, and it really helps with the disease surveillance and the inspection from Sophie's perspective, and ultimately that will allow you to take the stress off a little bit in that sort of situation, but also allow you to get back to trading and as quickly as possible. So disease prevention and early intervention is far more effective and less costly than it is to treat. So if you can prevent foot rot from coming in, if you can prevent anything from any of those diseases, lice, you name it, any of those things coming in, if you can prevent it, the cost of that is far less than it is to then go treat or eradicate that condition from your property. So when we're talking about preparing an on-farm biosecurity plan, the first point of call is to sit down and think, okay, what is my ultimate goal and what do I want to achieve from implementing that biosecurity plan? And obviously the ultimate goal is to prevent the risk of those diseases, pests and weeds from entering. But, is it a specific disease? Does your area have higher rainfall so virulent foot rot is more of an issue, and so you're wanting to make sure that that is a core component of your biosecurity plan? You then want to sit down against those goals and assess the risks or the likelihood and the consequence of those diseases, pests, weeds from happening or occurring onto your property. Then you need to document what you're already doing to minimise risks. So you might already have a footbath at your gate, for example, or gate signs to direct people where to go as they're entering the property or to call you before they enter a production zone. You then need to create an action plan to prioritise improvements on your on-farm biosecurity. So it's all well and good to document what you're already doing, but we really need to encourage people to document an action plan, capture those points of where you are now and where you want to be so that you can see the vision and put the steps in place to continuously improve your on-farm biosecurity, particularly as new technologies become available. And then the other really important thing is to review your plan annually. So having that plan sitting there is all well and good, but it needs to be an active document. It can't just be a stagnant document. And so making sure that you're reviewing your plan, reviewing your action plan to say, have I done the steps because I want to be at point B by 2022? Have I done the right things to be able to get there? So as I said, the first step after you've come up with your goals is to assess your risks. So when you're conducting a risk assessment, you're considering the potential hazards present. You're identifying the odds of that hazardous event occurring and consider the damages that would be caused by that event. So a potential hazard, as I said, might be virulent foot rot. I live in quite a dry part of South Australia. So for example, the odds of virulent foot rot becoming a huge problem for me on my property may be lower than say someone that experiences quite high rainfall in the southeast or going into some of those western parts of Victoria. And then consider the damages that would be caused by that event. So obviously, if it's higher likely, it's more likely that your damages will be higher. So once you have identified a hazard, so for example, this might, in this example, I'll use a new livestock entering the property. You can identify the consequence. So if I'm a stud producer, having a disease incursion like foot rot may have considerable impacts on my animal health and production, but it will also have an impact on my reputation and image. So the consequence of a disease incursion would be considered quite high. So we're talking about long-term state or national or damage to my reputation or my image, but it would also have considerable impacts on my animal production. So it may not necessarily be deaths unless I go to a severe eradication for that foot rot, but it will certainly cause illness and injury to those livestock. And once we have captured the consequence from that first table I showed in my previous slide across the top here, we can then look at the likelihood of that disease, of that consequence from occurring. So if it's high and high, then my risk is high. And we can then go into our risk response table 3, and it's indicating that an intervention is required. So it could be, for example, if I'm a stud producer and I've bought in some recip ewes for my breeding program, making sure that I'm testing those animals to ensure that they are free from foot rot, for example, quarantining them for the appropriate period of time to make sure that they are free from that disease, and putting that intervention in place to minimise the risk of introducing that disease into the rest of my flock. And then these examples are from the Animal Health Australia Biosecurity Plan template, which you can download off the Farm Biosecurity website. But basically all you're doing here is capturing what the risk is against the potential consequence. And then obviously there's a whole bunch of supporting documents that can sit behind these points. So things like your animal health declarations and documenting which livestock you've isolated and you're monitoring if you've purchased them in. And our next steps are to then identify strategies to reduce the risk and implement the strategies. And this is where I'm going to pass over to Sophie and take the reins.
Thanks, Sam. I'll just have to get you to change the slides for me, Em, though, because I can't do that on mine. So developing a biosecurity plan. So a biosecurity plan is obviously designed for producers to capture what they're doing on farm and to minimise the risk of pests and diseases, which Emma's just specifically gone through. Biosecurity plans have obviously are important because for farm assurance programs like the LPA accreditation, which we have when we're moving livestock on an MVD, and there's a number of planning templates available. So what I'm going to go through today, thanks Em for letting me be able to control that. Yep. Oops. No, I went too fast. Sorry about that. What I wanted to go through today is the 6 essentials of what we need to put into a biosecurity plan. And I want to keep that really, wow, that is really just going to its own world, sorry. Basically, I want to keep it really practical of what is actually important to put in a biosecurity plan. And from my experience of working with producers that have had a disease outbreak, or you know, they've had loss of production, and we need to work out where it's come in and how to prevent that further, and prevent it between flocks or herds is really important as well. So let's go through that. Stephen, I've just seen your question come through. We'll go through the sheep health statement, which is the sheep health deck, in a second. So the first one is inputs, which hopefully our screen will move across in a second. There we go. So essential, the first one that we want to be all over is inputs. So making smart purchases. Don't bring home problems onto your property without actually knowing what's there. So the National Health Deck, so the Sheep Health Statement is now termed the National Sheep Health Declaration. There's actually one for cattle, so the National Cattle Health Declaration. There's one for goats as well. We can pop that into some of the resources that we send for you at the end if you want, but you can find them on the Farm Biosecurity website, which we've got the details at the end of this presentation. Why is it important? For cattle and for sheep, or for all of the animals basically, that you can actually get a health declaration for. It's just making sure that the person who's selling the animals are making a declaration that they're free from specific diseases. So sheep, it's lice, yonis; foot rot; for cattle, pestivirus, yonis. And it's important because that gives you a leg to stand on if you've purchased in some new stock and they've turned up and they've literally just run off the truck, and you've seen something that's not quite right with them. You've called your vet and say there's something that's not quite right with these stock, they're lame, or they're not what I've purchased. And if you've got a National Sheep Health Deck or a National Cattle Health Deck, it's basically a statutory declaration that the person who sold those animals are saying, yeah, those animals is free from diseases from everything that I can see. So it's important to actually have that as a backup documentation for you when you're purchasing. It's kind of like an insurance plan. They're free and it's easy to do. In some states like SA, it's for every movement, it's actually a required document. Obviously it's not in Victoria, but I'd really encourage you, if you're going to purchase in stock, to actually get that, because they've got the major things that we need to be concerned about. Generally what we need to be concerned about on most properties or most commercial properties, we can actually make sure that those animals are free from diseases. The second thing we need to think about when we're talking about inputs in our biosecurity plan is implementing an isolation period. So for new and stray animals, so a lot of people will say 3 weeks. 3 weeks is the golden rule in terms of weed seeds. That's what generally a lot of people will be able to see if there was a disease that it is coming with those stock that you can't see when they've come straight off the truck. Generally, most diseases, hopefully you'd be able to see within that 3-week period. In saying that, I always say to people, it's really a good idea, depending where you're purchasing stock from and where the risks may lay between the areas that you're purchasing stock from. So if you're concerned about yonis, for instance, in sheep, and they're not coming from a sheep mat flock, you could potentially do fecal testing and keep them separated for a period of time. If you're concerned about virulent foot rot coming onto your property, keep those sheep isolated until the next spread period, which will generally be a spring period. So nice 20-degree days when you walk across the grass, you get moisture on your boots. Keep them separated from your normal home flock or your self-replacing flock for that period of time. For cattle, for pestivirus, if you're buying in cows that are pregnant and you don't know what the source of the property that you bought, if they don't have a JBAS score of 5 or 6, keep those cows isolated and carved down, and check the status of any heifers that you're going to keep from them. You're going to keep them so you can know that you don't have any PIs in your herd. So implementing an isolation period or quarantine period, depending upon the diseases that you may find that you're worried about, is what I normally suggest. If you're not sure about exactly how long you should keep that isolation period for, always have a chat to your vet. You can talk to Animal Health Australia, you can talk to everyone else, so as well, like your government vets or your private vets, because they can help you work out what those quarantine periods should be. Drench resistance, 100%. The anonymous attendees just put in a drench resistance. Drench resistant worms need to be considered and is not on the health statement. Completely agree with that. normally what I'd say when we do an introduction protocol, so I normally do an introduction protocol of a, particularly for sheep, doing a 4 actives, making sure at least one of those actives are a new age active, so like a StarTech or a Zolvix, keeping them in the same yard for 2 days, letting them pass out any of those potentially worms that haven't been hit with the actual drench, and then moving them into another quarantine area for another 2 to 3 weeks, but also doing a drench check 14 days after you've drenched them to make sure that you haven't actually got any more drench resistant worms on board there. So 100% agree, need to consider drench resistance in worms. You need to consider your feed sources coming into your property. So ask for a commodity vendor deck and make sure that the feed that you are getting is clean. So making sure you're adhering to the ruminant feed ban, so the RAM feeding, so making sure you're not feeding any mammalian product to ruminants, and obviously following swill feeding rules. You also need to consider watering points too, because inputs for water, depending what type of water sources you have, that's obviously a consideration of if you're purchasing in water or where your water is coming from. If it's coming from downstream, making sure that weed seeds aren't coming through it in with it, or if it is, making sure you've got a plan to prevent that from spreading through your farm. Just go to the next essential. I can, yep. So this is an example of the National Sheep Health Deck. This is the most current one. And then we just send Cattle Health Deck. These both, like I said before, these both are found on the Farm Biosecurity website, and they're the most up-to-date ones. Second essential one, we need to talk about developing a biosecurity protocol, implementing entry and exit procedures. We had a question in the Q&A box before about utility providers. 100% very common question. What do we do to prevent or limit the biosecurity risk of utility providers coming onto your property? Because obviously they have passageway under power lines and such. So first step is to restrict the number of access points that you can have onto your property, and also making sure you've got a visitor biosecurity sign on all the gates where they can access. Also, having something to say, directing them to do something before they enter the property. So whether that's call you, ring you on the UHF, come to the house or come to the office, whatever it is, that actually gives you a legal stance that you have a biosecurity protocol on farm, and that you're requesting everyone who's going to come onto your farm to actually adhere to that biosecurity protocol. So accessing, making sure you're restricting the people and the visitors to specific areas where they can come into. So it depends on your farm setup, because if you've got farm like roads running through your farm, that can be really difficult. But making sure that you have clearly marked areas of where you want people to go is really important. So I'll talk through working out where warm and hot zones are on your property on a map, because it's a little bit easier then, and what we need to have in a map. But making sure that you've really thought about where people can go, contractors can go, trying to limit the exposure of your animals to those people. Assess the risk of visitors and machinery. So if they have regular contact with other people, so I would hazard a guess that a vet coming onto your property that's been to 4 other farms that morning has a higher risk of bringing something onto your property as compared to someone, say a bank manager who hasn't gone onto another property and it's only going to go to the house for, hasn't been on another property for 2 to 3 weeks and is only going to go to your house. It's going to have a lower risk than the vet. Hopefully the vets will have good biosecurity protocols, but making sure you know who actually is coming onto your farm and making sure that you've actually thought about how we can keep your farm safe from that. So do you need to have a wash station for them, or will they come clean? Will you ask them to actually make sure you wash your boots before you come into the into the working areas where the sheep are? How about you jump in my vehicle, because I know you've been around other properties in your vehicle. Jump in mine and we can go down to the yards and have a look at the sheep that way, or the cattle. Keep visitor records. So these can be easily written if you're only having a few visitors in your farm diary. Just knowing when someone's been there, a contact detail or a contact number if you had to get in touch with them again, and you know what they were there for is important. Otherwise, if you've got a lot of people coming onto your property, it's really a good idea to print out a visitor record template. You can get them off the Farm Biosecurity website. They're free, they're easy to use. It's quite like a easy to use, like we're all getting used to QR codes. So that is basically essentially a visitor record. Minimise the lending of vehicles, machinery and equipment to others. So that's obviously all about preventing weed seeds and potentially disease, bacteria, virus actually that could live in mud or dirt or dust, transferring between property to property. And obviously, once again, install the farm biosecurity signs on the gates. I would say with the farm biosecurity signs, just make sure you've got that detail of what to do for that before people enter. Essential number 3 is production practices. So identify any pests and disease that could be an issue on your property. Monitor livestock regularly for unusual clinical signs. It's really important. If you're seeing something that's not quite right in your animals, so they're laying down more, they're drooling, they're lame, they're not doing the way that what you would expect them to be doing compared to the amount of feed they're having, or that you've got dead stock, make sure you call someone. It's really, really simple to call someone and help actually get a diagnosis on it and a treatment plan or a management plan before other losses can happen. Increase the monitoring during periods of high risk. Everyone would be doing that anyway. I'm sure everyone knows we all go around our waters a lot more frequently when it's drought or in hot summer as compared to in winter. Participate in any surveillance or biosecurity programs. So that's all about things like the TSE programs. So if you have a cow or a sheep that's acting a little unusual, starting to go down, if it's a sheep, it's biting its wool, or if it's a cow, it's got changing mentation, so it's a bit lethargic. You can actually, if you're doing a post-mortem on them, the vets can actually submit their brains to actually being part of the Australian TSE, so the Scrapie and Mad Cow Freedom Assurance Program, which is a really cool program that you get a little bit of money back for actually that animal, and hopefully vets can work out what's actually going on with that. Like I said, if you see any unusual signs of disease, call the EAD hotline. They're just vets like me who are manning that phone to help you understand what your responsibilities are to help mitigate that further risk to other animals in that flock or herd, and also to get a vet out there straight away so that we can actually work out what's going on. Just going on to the next screen. Yep. There's that number again, the EAD Watch Hotline. I'd really recommend everyone to just pop that into your mobile phones if you can. 1-800-675-888. Once again, 1-800-675-888. It's better to call. I've called it multiple times. It's helpful. It's just good sometimes to get peace of mind if you can't get your normal private vet or government vet on the phone and you're just not quite 100% sure what's going on. Just moving to the next slide. So production practices continued. Ensure carcass disposal is appropriate. So do you actually have a plan in place if you had multiple animals die at one time? So if you had, for instance, a Barber's pole outbreak, what would you do if you had 20 cows die or 30 sheep? How would you dispose of them? And making sure that their carcasses aren't going to cause a significant environmental impact on your land later on that could potentially limit your productivity in that area. If you're involved in an intensive system like a feedlot, how do you manage that effluent? Just making sure that it's actually not impact production, but also the environment later on. Making sure, one thing that I would say is when you're using your chemicals or you're doing your drench or your vaccination in particular, making sure you know how to do it correctly. And you may know how to do it correctly, but if you have any staff that's coming on, making sure that they know how to do it correctly, because there's lots of sheep that come back through the abattoir monitoring surveillance and National Sheep Health Monitoring Program that actually have vaccination lesions that have been, there's been lots of trim. So making sure people know how to vaccinate correctly is really important. Maintaining records of all your chemicals, so your vaccines and drenches. Really quick little tip here, if you're not writing it down as soon as you get your drenches and your vaccines, because I'll put my hand up, I never do that. I always forget to write it as soon as I get back from the shop. I just take a photo of it on my phone when I'm in the yards, when I'm about to drench something or vaccinate something. I normally take a photo of, I've got sheep, so I take a photo of their flock tag, so I know what colour it is, take a photo of the bottle of whatever I'm about to use, and the batch number and the expiry. That's really important, because if there's ever a recall of any drugs, then you at least know what animals that's drenchal vaccine is actually relating to. And then that way you can put it actually in your proper records in your farm diary or onto a animal health record, which is templates on the Farm Biosecurity website. You can put that in there easily later on when you're in the office. Maintain boundary fences. That's pretty straightforward, and I think everyone on this webinar would completely understand that one. And fence off rubbish dumps and infrastructure such as old ditch, sheds and yards and chemical storage areas. That's obviously just to restrict like incidents of metal poisoning. So lead poisoning is really common in cattle because they're so adventurous and they're inquisitive. They go and eat the lead batteries because they like the anionic salts. Then you get lead poisoning. So making sure any old yards and everything like that are actually fenced off, so there's no risk there to your livestock. Interestingly, arsenic dips also is a big thing with sheep. Essential number 4, pests and weeds. So identify any feral animals, pests and weeds of significance. So they're obviously important, particularly for lambs, when you're lambing. Foxes, wedgies, those types of things are obviously really important. Can't obviously do anything about wedgies, but foxes is something that you can actually do something about. Identify weeds affected areas on your property and implement control to prevent these spreads. So like I was saying before, if you've got a waterway running through your property, making sure that you keep checking on those weeded areas is important, particularly too if you are getting lots of seed build up in carcasses. So if you're getting lots of trim on your carcasses, that's what can be important. You can obviously also have vegetable matter in your wool, which can degrade some of your prices. Maintain your boundary fences once again, and fencing around carcasses and old rubbish disposal areas. Now, essential 5 outputs. So send all livestock with an MVD or equivalent and a national health deck. That's obviously giving the purchaser assurance that the stock that you are selling is as high quality as you possibly can, and familiarise yourself with the land transport of livestock standards and guidelines. So the fit to load guidelines, if in doubt, leave it out. So that's a really handy little guide book that says, if it's not weight bearing on all 4 limbs, if it can't see out of at least one eye, if it's got a horn growing into its eye, they're not fit to load. If it's got a massive hernia, it's not fit to load. If it's severely, heavily pregnant, it's not fit to load. If it's severely emaciated, it's not fit to load. It's really helpful to actually have a little guideline there online for free. And you can also order one in a little copy so you can put it in your glove box of your ute. That's really important. We can send through the link on the Q&A. I can do that in a second for you, just so you've got it. It's really important. If you're ever not sure about if something's fit to load, leave it out. You can also call your local vet or your government vet just to try and help decipher what is fit to load and what isn't. Particularly important. We did a lot of it in the drought, working out what was fit to load and what wasn't fit to load, just helping people to make sure those animals' welfare is put into the utmost care, but also helping the producer still be profitable there. To find balance sometimes. Just moving on to essential 6. Train, plan and record. So make sure all staff are trained to be able to identify sick animals and are aware of the disease reporting protocol. So on your property, that might be if you've got staff, go and talk to you. If you aren't sure what it is, call your local vet. If you can't get onto them, call your government vet. If you can't get onto them, call the EAD hotline. That's basically a protocol for you to be able to work out when you need to call someone. Have plans for natural disasters like floods or droughts, which I'm sure everyone's had some type of flood or drought planning involved in their business. That's just basically centers around making sure that you've got the right amount of feed on hand for the stock, and just putting trigger limits in of when you need to maybe sell stock or reduce stock, or buy more feed in. Make forward planning the norm. Recording your experience and training registers is also really helpful if you ever do get an LPA audit. So there are training records on the Farm Biosecurity website as well. Records, so keeping accurate and up-to-date records. So like I was saying, you can take photos in the paddock and then, or in the yards, and then write them, transpose them onto your record sheet if you use a record sheet, a template, or you could do it on an online system if you've got an online system, or obviously in your farm diary. Review your record keeping and planning processes regularly, and consider how to keep your records. So what's easy for you to find? If you don't have a lot of phone reception or internet reception, maybe a paper-based version is easier for you. That's totally fine. Just making sure you've actually got some records somewhere. So if you do have a disease outbreak or poor performance, the vet can actually help you determine what animals might be affected or how we can best progress forward, and also will obviously help in terms of LPA audits. Just moving on. So this is what I was talking about with mapping out the farm. So it's really handy to get either a Google Maps satellite version image or a Google Earth image, or you may already have some satellite maps of your property, and just defining where the cool, warm and hot zones are. So cool zones are where people may access, like visitors may access, that have limited contact with livestock or crops. So that's obviously around the house. And that's obviously not going to cause too much of an issue because most people won't have their stock up around the house. Warm zones where people and vehicles may need to access in order to drop off inputs, so sheds, silos, stockyards. And then hot zones are where production is undertaken at most times of the year, and you really want to restrict the access of who can go in there. So that's where, if you had a sheep or a cow down in the paddock, get the vet to jump in with you. They can go to that animal with you in your car, and that reduces the risk of them bringing on weed seeds in their wheel arches and that type of thing. The other part of mapping out the farm, which hopefully this slide moves across, is really identifying where you may have existing landfills or dead pits is really important, popping that on there, particularly if you've had, if you've been on your property for multiple years, like back in the 80s, if you've, had big dead pits on your property elsewhere, mapping that out and knowing where they are is really important, particularly if you ever had an emergency animal disease. It's really good to be able to notify people to say, yeah, we've already got a dead pit there. Knowing where your groundwater is and where your runoff goes. Important ecological systems. So if you've got, a rare or endangered bird or lizard, whatever it may be, making sure you know where that habitat is. Where your water table variations are really important as well, particularly big variations between, 5 meters, 10 meters, 20 meters, wherever it is. Just knowing that can be very helpful when you actually, if you ever do come into an emergency kind of situation where you have to bury multiple livestock. Identify where your quarantine and hospital paddocks normally will be. Wash down areas, so that's generally at your entrance, your entry points. Where your yards are is really important too, and trying to just denote if you've got wood yards as compared to steel yards can be helpful, particularly if you did have a fire on your property. Sometimes obviously wood yards will burn, where steel yards hopefully will be staying there, so that can be really helpful as well. And neighbouring dwellings and work areas can be really important to denote as well. So the next slide that we've got is just steps to take during an EAD. So that's all about contain and isolate the livestock into a secure location or premise, contact the relevant authority or emergency disease watch hotline. So that's that 1-800 number again, and have a notebook and pen ready, because basically what happens if you call a vet or the EAD hotline because you suspect that something's not right, you may have an emergency animal disease on your property. They'll give you really short instructions of what to do in the interim until they can get there. You just have to follow those. Most of the times it will just be don't move any stock on or off the property, and try not to get anyone else to come on the property until we work out exactly what it is, and just limit the exposure of other livestock to the potentially affected animals. So that's basically what we have to do when an EAD occurs, and just make sure you've got your biosecurity plan, and really importantly your map. Making sure you've got that map can be really helpful, and where your livestock movements have been around the property is really helpful in that situation. Moving to the next slide. So key messages. Having a biosecurity plan is important to know how you are preventing pests, weeds and disease from entering your property, working out what pests and diseases are actually of most risk for your property, and then putting something in practical, particularly around limiting the spread onto your property. So those quarantine periods, and also knowing the stock you're buying, is really important. Understanding what would happen in an emergency animal disease incursion to help you plan for the worst. So that's basically having that map and knowing the EAD watch hotline number. The better the biosecurity plan, the more likely it is to be able to get back to business sooner. So as I've said before, a lot of these resources can actually be found on the Farm Biosecurity website. So it's literally farmbiosecurity.com.au. And up the top there, you can see in the top toolbar, there's toolkits, crops, livestock, get help, news stories. They're really helpful because you can get obviously the national health decks, and also the lots of other free templates, so you can actually put your own biosecurity plan together from a lot of their resources that are on this website. Just moving through, that's us, that's Em and I. If you have any questions from this presentation or in the future about biosecurity on your property, feel free to give us an email at the biosecurity@Animal Health Australia email, and we'll do our best to get back to you. I'll now pass back over to Patrick to wrap up.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Sophie and Emily. There was a lot of fantastic information in there. So as I think Sophie and Emily both mentioned, we will spend some time after the webinar collating all relevant information, and we can send that out to the participants today. And there will also be a recording of this webinar available after the webinar. So if you have any information you need to go back and clarify, you'll definitely be able to do that. Now, just before we wrap up, I will quickly just check the Q&A section to see if there's any outstanding questions. But for everyone still online, we do have one more poll we'd love to get you to undertake for us, just following that information. So what I'll do is I'll just launch that now. And if you could just spend the next few minutes just filling that out, we would really, really appreciate that. So in terms of any outstanding questions, it doesn't look like there's any open questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to ask them now. Otherwise, we will have Emily and Sophie's contact details available after the webinar, which you can definitely reach out, or even reach out to StockSense if you have any questions. So I'll just give you a few moments to complete that. So we've just had a question come through from Mick just about accessing and sharing the recording. So Mick, what we'll do is afterwards, we'll make sure that we get the recording up on the VFF website, and we will also email out a link to the recording to everyone who's registered for this webinar. Perfect. So we've just got the last few responses coming through to that poll. So I will shut that off in 3, 2, 1. Thank you very much for that, everyone. Now, it looks like there are no more outstanding questions. So just On behalf of Stock Sense, I would just like to thank Emily and Sophie for joining us today and sharing their wealth of knowledge. We very much appreciate it. And finally, I'd just like to thank everybody who registered today. We really appreciate you getting involved with Stock Sense. I know it's been a while since Stock Sense last hosted an event, but we're really eager to get the project back up and running, and we hopefully will be able to see you all out at an event in the future, hopefully face to face. In the meantime, anyway, feel free to reach out if you do have any questions. We very much look forward to engaging with everyone. All right, thank you.